Please subscribe to the channel for more enthralling stories. The air in the abandoned warehouse hung thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the musty scent of decay. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose face was etched with the grim lines of too many years spent staring into the abyss of human depravity, pulled back the yellow crime scene tape. Beside him, his junior partner, Detective Lena Hansen, a sharp, observant woman barely out of her 30s, adjusted her latex gloves, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Another one, Miles?" Lena's voice was low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the morbid tranquility of the scene. Miles merely grunted, his gaze sweeping over the grotesque tableau before them. A headless corpse, male, lay sprawled amidst the dust-laden crates, its limbs splayed at unnatural angles. The dark stain beneath it had long since dried to a sinister black, a testament to the time that had elapsed since the brutal act. The lack of a head was not merely a gruesome detail. It was a deliberate, chilling act of dehumanization, a calculated move to hinder identification. "No ID, no wallet, no distinguishing features," Miles muttered, running a gloved hand through his thinning gray hair. Someone didn't want this guy found, or at least not easily. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead forensic pathologist, a man whose calm demeanor belied the horrors he routinely encountered, was already at work, his team meticulously documenting every detail. Blunt force trauma to the neck, followed by decapitation, likely with a heavy, sharp instrument, Thorne reported, his voice clinical, detached. "Time of death is harder to pinpoint without the head, but I'd estimate between 4 to 6 weeks ago, given the state of decomposition." Lena crouched, examining the floor. "No signs of a struggle, Miles. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Or he was incapacitated first," Miles countered, his mind already racing through possibilities. Drugs? Surprise attack? The warehouse itself offered few clues. It was a cavernous space, long disused, its windows boarded up, leaving it in perpetual twilight. Graffiti marred the brick walls, cryptic symbols and faded tags telling tales of forgotten lives. The only recent activity, it seemed, was the grim deposition of the body. The initial sweep yielded nothing of immediate value. No weapon, no personal effects, no clear entry or exit points. It was a clean crime, or at least one that had been meticulously cleaned up. The silence of the warehouse pressed in on them, punctuated only by the soft click of cameras and the hushed murmurs of the forensic team. "We'll need to run DNA," Lena stated the obvious. "See if we can get a hit in Cody's." Miles nodded. "And check missing persons. Someone, somewhere, is looking for this guy." The following days were a monotonous grind of paperwork, phone calls, and dead ends. The DNA sample, meticulously extracted from a bone fragment, was sent to the lab. The waiting game began, a familiar dance of patience and frustration for detectives. Then, a week later, the call came. Lena was at her desk, sifting through missing persons reports, her eyes glazing over with the sheer volume of data, when her phone buzzed. It was Dr. Thorne. "Detective Hansen, we have a hit." Thorne's voice was uncharacteristically animated. "A partial match from the Cody's database." Lena's heart leaped. "A match? Who is it?" "Not the victim directly," Thorne clarified, a hint of professional excitement in his tone, "but a familial match. The victim's DNA shows a strong paternal link to a woman named Sarah Jenkins." Lena scribbled the name down. "Sarah Jenkins? Any record on her?" "Minor traffic violations, nothing criminal," Thorne replied. "She's listed as residing in the suburbs, a wife and mother of 2. Miles, overhearing the conversation, walked over, his expression a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. "A familial match, huh? So, the victim's father, son, brother?" "Potentially," Thorne confirmed. "The sample is strong enough to indicate a first-degree relative. We'll need to do more detailed analysis to pinpoint the exact relationship, but this gives us a starting point." The name Sarah Jenkins was a mundane entry in the vast sea of public records. A suburban housewife, married to a successful architect, Mark Jenkins, with 2 teenage children. Her life, on the surface, appeared unremarkable, a picture of domestic bliss. Miles and Lena drove to the Jenkins residence, a meticulously manicured house in a quiet, tree-lined street. The kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened. The air of suburban tranquility felt almost oppressive, a stark contrast to the grim reality they carried with them. When Sarah Jenkins answered the door, she was a vision of understated elegance, a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked at them with an expectant, slightly curious expression, as if they were canvassers or delivering a package. "Mrs. Jenkins? I'm Detective Corbin, and this is Detective Hanson," Miles began, his voice softening, a practice technique for putting civilians at ease. "We're investigating a case, and your name came up in our inquiries." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "My name? Is everything all right?" Her gaze flickered between the 2 detectives, a hint of unease beginning to cloud her features. "We have reason to believe you might be related to a victim in a homicide investigation," Lena interjected, watching Sarah's reaction closely. "We obtained a DNA match." The color drained from Sarah's face. Her eyes, moments ago so warm, now held a flicker of something unreadable shock. Yes, but also a deeper, more profound fear. "A homicide?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Related to me? We believe the victim is a close paternal relative," Miles explained. "Do you have any male relatives who are currently missing, or who you haven't heard from recently?" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her knuckles white. She looked around, as if searching for an escape, a way to make this surreal conversation disappear. I don't understand," she stammered. "My father passed away years ago. My brother lives out of state. My husband is at work. We'd like to ask you a few more questions, Mrs. Jenkins," Lena pressed gently. "Perhaps inside?" Sarah hesitated for a long moment, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. Finally, she nodded, her movements stiff. She led them into a pristine living room, filled with tasteful furniture and framed family photos. Photos of her smiling husband, her cheerful children, a life that seemed utterly unburdened by the darkness Miles and Lena brought with them. As they sat, Sarah wrung her hands, her gaze fixed on a distant point. "I honestly don't know who you could be talking about," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "We found a headless male body in an abandoned warehouse a few weeks ago," Miles stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a deliberate tactic to gauge her reaction. "The DNA from the victim points to a strong familial link with you." Sarah gasped a small, choked sound. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to banish the horrific image Miles had just conjured. When she opened them, they were filled with tears. Could it be my son?" she whispered, the raw fear in her voice unmistakable. Miles and Lena exchanged a quick glance. "We don't have an age yet," Miles replied, "but the DNA indicates a paternal relationship, meaning the victim is either your father, your brother, or possibly your son. Or, in rarer cases, a half-brother." "I only have one son, Michael," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's 19, away at college. He called me just last night." Lena pulled out a photo of the victim, a reconstruction of his face based on forensic data, albeit a somewhat generic one given the lack of a head. "Does this look familiar to you, Mrs. Jenkins?" Sarah barely glanced at the image before shaking her head vehemently. No, that's not Michael. I would know my own son." Her distress seemed genuine, her fear palpable. Yet, there was an underlying current, a subtle tension that Lena couldn't quite place. It was almost as if Sarah was playing a role, or perhaps, struggling to maintain a carefully constructed facade. "Do you have any other male relatives that might fit the description?" Lena prodded gently. "Any cousins, uncles you've lost touch with?" Sarah shook her head again, her hands still clasped tightly together. No one I can think of." Miles leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "Mrs. Jenkins, a headless body was found. This is a very serious matter. Any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, could be crucial. Are you absolutely certain you have no other close male relatives, living or deceased, whose DNA might be linked to yours in this way? Sarah's gaze darted around the room, finally landing on a framed photo on the mantelpiece. It was an old, faded photograph showing a younger Sarah, radiant and smiling, beside a tall, dark-haired man with an arm around her. The man had a striking resemblance to the forensic reconstruction Lena had shown her. Miles followed her gaze. "Who is that, Mrs. Jenkins?" Sarah's eyes welled up again, but this time, the tears seemed to carry a different weight: regret, sorrow, and perhaps a hidden secret. "That's my brother," she whispered, her voice cracking. Thomas Davies." "Davies?" Lena questioned. "Not Jenkins." Sarah nodded slowly. "My maiden name. Thomas never married. He was estranged from the family for a long time." "Estranged?" Miles asked, seizing on the word. "How long is a long time?" "Over 20 years, Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible. "He left home after a big argument with my father. We haven't seen or heard from him since." "And you never reported him missing?" Lena pressed. Sarah looked away, her cheeks flushing. We thought he just wanted to be left alone. He was always a bit of a wanderer, and my father was very strict. It was a difficult situation." The pieces began to click into place. A long-lost brother, estranged for decades, whose DNA would naturally match Sarah's. The timing, the nature of the crime, it all pointed to a life lived in the shadows. A life Sarah Jenkins had clearly tried to forget. "Do you have any idea where Thomas might have been living, what he was doing?" Miles asked, his voice now sharper, more urgent. Sarah shook her head. "No, not for years. We just assumed he was out there somewhere, living his life." "Mrs. Jenkins, if this is your brother, Thomas Davies, he's been murdered," Lena stated, her voice firm. "And you are the only link we have to him. We need you to tell us everything you know about Thomas. His friends, his enemies, any relationships he might have had. Anything." Sarah finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. The carefully constructed facade of the suburban housewife crumbled, revealing a woman burdened by a long-held secret, a past she had tried desperately to bury. He was involved in some bad things, even before he left," she confessed between sobs. "Petty crimes, hanging around with the wrong crowd. My father tried to rein him in, but Thomas was always rebellious." "What kind of bad things?" Miles probed. "He got involved with a local gang, some drug dealing," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what the fight with my father was about. My father caught him with a stash of drugs, and Thomas just exploded. He packed a bag and left that night, and we never saw him again." The double life of Sarah Jenkins was slowly, painfully, coming into focus. The perfect suburban wife and mother, with a past intimately linked to a world of crime and violence. The headless corpse in the warehouse was not just a victim. It was a ghost from her past, a spectral figure dragging her carefully constructed present into the harsh light of a homicide investigation. As the detectives left the Jenkins residence, the suburban tranquility now felt like a thinly veiled illusion. Sarah Jenkins, it seemed, had more secrets than she let on, and the headless corpse of her long-lost brother was about to expose every single one of them. "So, Mrs. Jenkins has a skeleton in her closet, literally?" Lena remarked as they drove away. "And it's not just a skeleton, Lena," Miles corrected, his eyes narrowed in thought. "It's a headless skeleton, and it's starting to sing." The DNA match had not just identified a victim. It had opened a Pandora's box, revealing a hidden history, a secret life that was about to unravel with devastating consequences for Sarah Jenkins. The investigation had just begun, and the deeper they delved, the more tangled and treacherous the web of deceit would undoubtedly become. The truth, like a persistent shadow, was slowly but surely emerging from the darkness, threatening to consume everything in its path. The revelation of Thomas Davies as the likely victim sent a ripple through the lives of everyone connected to Sarah Jenkins. For Miles and Lena, It was the first solid lead in a case that had initially seemed insurmountable. They delved into Thomas's past with renewed vigor, piecing together the fragmented existence of a man who had vanished for over 2 decades. Sarah, despite her initial distress, remained guarded. She provided a few old photographs of Thomas, grainy images of a younger man with a defiant glint in his eyes. She recounted the argument with her father, the circumstances of Thomas's abrupt departure, and the family's subsequent silence on the matter. It was clear that the shame and anger surrounding Thomas's involvement with gangs and drugs had led to his erasure from their family narrative. So, Thomas Davies was involved in drug dealing with a local gang, Miles mused, poring over a faded high school yearbook photo of Thomas. That's a pretty big secret to keep for 20 years, especially when you're living the perfect suburban life. Lena nodded, flipping through her notes. And the fact that she never reported him missing? That speaks volumes. Either she genuinely believed he just wanted to disappear, or there was a deeper reason for the silence. Their investigation led them to the dusty archives of local police records. They found a handful of arrests for Thomas Davies in his late teens and early 20s. Possession of marijuana, petty theft, disturbing the peace. Nothing that suggested he was a hardened criminal, but enough to confirm Sarah's account of his troubled youth. The gang she mentioned, the Cobras, had been a minor player in the local drug scene back then, eventually fizzling out or being absorbed by larger, more organized syndicates. The Cobras, huh? Miles squinted at an old police report. They were small fry, mostly street-level dealing. Not exactly the kind of people who'd decapitate someone over a turf war from 20 years ago. People change, Miles, Lena reminded him. And so do gangs. What if Thomas got involved with something bigger, something more dangerous after he left home? The problem was, Thomas Davies had left no digital footprint. In the early 2000s, social media was nascent, and most of his adult life was lived before the widespread adoption of smartphones and online identities. He was a ghost in the digital age, making their task significantly harder. They interviewed Sarah's parents, an elderly couple living in a quiet retirement community. They were initially reluctant to discuss Thomas, their faces hardening at the mention of his name. Their grief, however, was evident, albeit tinged with a deep-seated resentment. He chose his path, Sarah's father, a stern-faced man named Robert, declared, his voice trembling slightly. We tried to help him, but he wouldn't listen. He broke our hearts. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, was more fragile, her eyes filling with tears as she spoke of her lost son. He was a good boy, deep down, she whispered, her voice laced with sorrow, just easily led astray. They confirmed Sarah's story about Thomas's involvement with the Cobras and the bitter argument that led to his departure. They had resigned themselves to the fact that he was gone, assuming he had simply moved on to another life, perhaps in another city. The idea that he had been brutally murdered was a fresh wound, tearing open old scars. Did Thomas have any significant relationships, romantic or otherwise, that you knew of? Lena asked gently. Eleanor paused, her brow furrowed in thought. There was a girl, I remember, a few years before he left. Her name was Maria. She was a sweet girl, but Thomas, he wasn't good for her. Maria what? Miles pressed. I don't remember her last name, Eleanor sighed. It was so long ago. She lived a few streets over, I think. Another thread, thin and frayed, but a thread nonetheless. Miles and Lena spent days tracking down anyone who might remember Maria, combing through old-school yearbooks and neighborhood directories. Finally, they found a Maria Rossi, now Maria Chun, living in a neighboring town. Maria Chun was a poised, professional woman, a successful accountant. She was clearly taken aback by the detective's visit, the mention of Thomas Davies bringing a cloud to her usually cheerful demeanor. Thomas? She repeated, her voice laced with a mixture of surprise and melancholy. It's been decades. I haven't heard that name in so long. She confirmed her past relationship with Thomas, describing him as charming but troubled, always teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He was wild, and I was drawn to that, she admitted, a wistful smile playing on her lips. But he was also kind in his own way. Did you know about his involvement with the Cobras? Lena asked. Maria nodded slowly. Yes, I tried to get him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He said he needed the money. He got involved with some rough characters, a guy named Snake and another one, Bullet. They were bad news. Snake and Bullet? Miles perked up. Do you remember their real names? No. Maria shook her head. Just their street names. They were his crew. The ones who got him into trouble. This was a breakthrough. Street names, while not as useful as real names, could still be a lead, especially when coupled with the context of the Cobras. Maria provided a few more details about Thomas's personality. His dreams of escaping their small town, his occasional outbursts of anger. She revealed that Thomas had a secret stash of money, hidden somewhere, which he claimed was his ticket to a new life. He told me he was going to save up enough to leave, to disappear and start over. Maria recalled, her eyes distant. He was always talking about escaping, about getting away from his family and the life he was trapped in. Did he ever tell you where he kept this money? Lena asked. Maria shook her head. No, just that it was safe. He was very secretive about it. As they left Maria's house, Miles's mind was racing. A secret stash of money, 2 decades ago, and a man who wanted to disappear. This is starting to sound less like a random act of violence and more like something connected to his past. Lena pulled out her phone. I'll start digging into Snake and Bullet in the old gang files. See if anything pops up. The search for Snake and Bullet proved difficult. The Cobras, as a gang, had faded into obscurity, and many of its members had either moved on, been incarcerated, or, in some cases, met violent ends. But Lena was tenacious. She cross-referenced old police reports, arrest records, and confidential informant files, searching for any mention of those 2 nicknames alongside Thomas Davies. Finally, after days of painstaking research, she found a hit. A man named Arthur Snake Johnson, a former Cobra member, had served time for drug trafficking in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was now out on parole, living in a rundown part of the city. The other name, Bullet, remained elusive. Arthur Johnson was a shadow of his former self, a gaunt man in his 50s, his face etched with the ravages of addiction and a hard life. He was wary, his eyes darting around the interrogation room like a trapped animal. Thomas Davies? He rasped when Miles mentioned the name. Haven't heard that name in forever. Thought he was dead years ago. Miles laid a photo of the forensic reconstruction on the table. He is now headless in a warehouse. Johnson's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something akin to fear in their depths. Headless? Damn, that's a rough way to go. You were involved with him in the Cobras, Lena stated, her voice calm but firm. We know about the drug dealing. Johnson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, that was a long time ago. Stupid kid stuff. What happened to Thomas? Miles pressed. Why did he disappear? Johnson hesitated, his gaze fixed on the table. He had a falling out with the crew. Said he was going to cut and run. Had some money saved up, he said. Enough to start fresh. Did you know where he was going? Lena asked. Johnson shook his head. Nah, he was pretty secretive about it. Just said he was tired of the life, wanted out. Did he have any enemies? Miles asked. Anyone who would want to see him dead, especially in such a brutal way? Johnson paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. There was a beef, a few months before he left, with a rival gang, the Vipers. They were bigger, meaner. Thomas got into a fight with one of their guys, a real hothead named Razor. Thomas put him in the hospital. Razor, Lena repeated, writing it down. Any real name? Don't remember, Johnson said. Just Razor. After that, Thomas was looking over his shoulder. The Vipers didn't forget a slight. And the money he had saved up? Miles continued. Did you know where he kept it? Johnson shook his head. No, but I always figured it was more than just drug money. He was always good at hustling, finding little scams. Said he had something big brewing, something that would set him up for life. The interview with Arthur Snake Johnson provided crucial new information. A rival gang, a hot-headed enemy, and the mention of a big scam. It painted a picture of Thomas Davies not just as a small-time drug dealer, but as a man who might have been involved in something far more lucrative and far more dangerous. Meanwhile, the DNA analysis on Sarah Jenkins's husband, Mark, came back. It was a standard procedure for any spouse in a familial DNA match, simply to rule out any unforeseen complications. The results, however, were anything but standard. Miles and Lena were in the lab when Dr. Thorne delivered the news, his face grim. Detectives, the DNA from the victim is not only a paternal match to Sarah Jenkins, Thorne began, his voice low. It's also a direct paternal match to her husband, Mark Jenkins. Miles stared at him, bewildered. A direct paternal match? How is that possible? Is Mark the victim's father? Thorne shook his head. No, the victim's age doesn't fit with Mark being his father. The victim, Thomas Davies, was in his 40s. Mark Jenkins is also in his 40s. They are brothers. A stunned silence filled the room. Lena's eyes widened in disbelief. Brothers? Mark Jenkins is Thomas Davies's brother. Thorne nodded. The genetic markers are undeniable. They share the same father. Miles's mind reeled. Sarah Jenkins had identified the victim as her brother, Thomas Davies. Now her husband, Mark Jenkins, was revealed to be Thomas's half-brother. But Sarah had consistently referred to Thomas as her brother, never mentioning a shared sibling with Mark. So, Mark Jenkins is also a Davies by birth? Lena asked, trying to untangle the convoluted family tree. Thorne consulted his notes. His birth certificate names his mother as Eleanor Davies and his father as Robert Davies. The same parents as Sarah and Thomas. Wait, Miles interjected, a new, chilling realization dawning on him. Sarah and Mark are married. If they share the same parents, then they're brother and sister. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of an unthinkable truth. Sarah Jenkins and Mark Jenkins, the picture-perfect suburban couple, were not just husband and wife, but also biologically brother and sister. And the headless corpse in the warehouse was their shared brother, Thomas. The double life of Sarah Jenkins was far more twisted and sinister than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a hidden past. It was an incestuous present, a dark secret that had been meticulously concealed for years. Oh my God, Lena whispered, her face pale. This isn't just a homicide. This is an unholy mess. Miles's mind raced, connecting the dots. The estrangement from Thomas, the family's silence, Sarah's guardedness. It all began to make a horrific kind of sense. The family had not just lost a son to the streets. They had lost two to an unspeakable secret. And Thomas, the black sheep, the wanderer, had returned to expose it all. We need to bring in Mark Jenkins, Miles said, his voice grim. And then Sarah. We have a lot of questions for both of them. The suburban fairy tale had shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing a dark, incestuous reality. The headless corpse of Thomas Davies was not just a victim of a past crime. He was the catalyst, the brutal truth-teller, exposing the monstrous secret that had festered within the Jenkins family for decades. The investigation had just taken a shocking, stomach-churning turn, leading them down a path far darker than they could have ever anticipated. The revelation that Sarah and Mark Jenkins were biological siblings, and that the victim, Thomas Davies, was their shared brother, sent shockwaves through the detective unit. The initial shock quickly gave way to a cold, analytical resolve. This wasn't just a homicide case anymore. It was a deep dive into the darkest corners of human behavior, a horrifying tapestry woven with deceit, incest, and murder. Miles and Lena agreed on a strategy. Bring Mark in first under the pretense of further questions about Thomas. They needed to gauge his reaction to the familial DNA match before confronting Sarah with the full, devastating truth. Mark Jenkins arrived at the precinct, looking every inch the successful architect. Immaculately dressed, composed, and utterly unsuspecting. He greeted them with a polite smile, a picture of suburban normalcy. The irony was almost unbearable. Detective Corbin, Detective Hansen, Mark said, extending a hand. You wanted to ask more about Thomas? Miles gestured for him to sit in the interrogation room. The sterile environment, with its two-way mirror, felt particularly stark against the backdrop of the secret they were about to expose. Mr. Jenkins, we've had some developments in the case. Miles began, his voice carefully neutral. We've confirmed the victim's identity as Thomas Davies. Mark's expression tightened slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. So it was Thomas. I'm deeply saddened to hear that. My wife told me he was estranged for a long time. It's truly tragic. Indeed, Lena interjected, watching him closely. We also ran a standard DNA comparison with you as Sarah's husband, just to rule out any potential familial links. Mark frowned. Why would you do that? I'm not related to Thomas. Miles leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Mr. Jenkins, the DNA results came back. They indicate that you are, in fact, Thomas Davies's brother. His full biological brother. The polite composure instantly shattered. Mark's face went white, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He stammered, his voice choked. That's impossible. My parents are Robert and Eleanor Jenkins. I have no brother named Thomas Davies. Your birth certificate lists your parents as Robert and Eleanor Davies, Lena corrected, laying a copy on the table. You changed your last name to Jenkins later in life, correct? Mark stared at the document, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The facade was crumbling, revealing the terror beneath. No, this is a mistake. My parents are Robert and Eleanor Jenkins. This can't be right. The DNA doesn't lie, Mr. Jenkins, Miles stated, his voice firm. You and Thomas Davies share the same parents. And so does Sarah. You, Sarah, and Thomas are all full siblings. The full weight of the truth crashed down on Mark. His body slumped in the chair, his hands flying to his head. No, oh my God, Sarah, no. The realization that he was married to his own sister, and that their murdered brother was the catalyst for this horrifying discovery, visibly broke him. He began to tremble, his sophisticated veneer dissolving into raw, primal fear and disgust. So you knew, Lena pressed, her voice devoid of sympathy. You and Sarah knew you were siblings when you married? Mark shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No, we didn't. We couldn't have. We grew up next door to each other. We were childhood sweethearts. We always thought we were cousins, distant cousins. Our parents told us our families were distantly related through our grandmothers. That's why we had the same maiden name. They covered it up. His story was frantic, desperate, a torrent of words tumbling out as he tried to explain the unimaginable. He claimed their parents, Robert and Eleanor, had orchestrated the elaborate deception. After Thomas ran away, the family had moved to a new neighborhood, changed their last name to Jenkins, and started a new life. They had fostered the belief that Sarah and Mark were distant cousins, a plausible enough explanation for their shared maiden name, given their parents' reluctance to discuss their past. Our parents were obsessed with appearances, Mark sobbed. They were so ashamed of Thomas, of the drug dealing, of the scandal. They wanted to start over, to erase the past. They moved us, changed our names, created a whole new history. They told us we were distantly related, enough to explain the shared surname. We fell in love, we got married. We never, ever suspected. Miles and Lena exchanged a look. It was a plausible, albeit sickening, narrative. The extreme measures some families would take to bury a scandal, to protect their reputation. When did you change your name? Miles asked, observing his breakdown with a cold detachment. After we moved, Mark choked out. When I was in my late teens. Sarah changed hers too. Our parents insisted it was for a fresh start, a clean slate. And Thomas? Lena questioned. Did he know about your new identities? Did he know you and Sarah were married? Mark nodded slowly. He found us. About 6 months ago. He tracked us down. A new chill ran down Miles's spine. He tracked you down? What did he want? Mark's eyes darted around the room, a fresh wave of panic washing over him. He wanted money. He said he knew our secret. He threatened to expose us, to ruin everything. Expose what, Mr. Jenkins? Miles pressed. The fact that you and Sarah are siblings? Or something else? Mark hesitated, his hands trembling. Both. He said he knew everything. About us, about our parents' lies. He said he'd tell our children, our friends, everyone, if we didn't pay him. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together with a horrifying precision. Thomas, the black sheep, returning from the shadows, not just as a long-lost brother, but as a blackmailer. The secret stash of money Maria Chun had mentioned, the big scam Thomas had been hinting at. Perhaps it wasn't just drugs. Perhaps it was the ultimate leverage, the truth about his siblings' incestuous marriage. How much did he want? Lena asked, her voice tight with disgust. A fortune, Mark whispered. $500,000. He said he'd take it and disappear again, for good this time. And did you pay him? Miles asked. Mark shook his head. We tried to negotiate. We said we didn't have that kind of money readily available. Sarah was terrified. She kept saying he would ruin us, ruin our children. So what happened then? Lena prompted, pushing for the climax of the story. Mark looked up, his eyes bloodshot. We met him at the warehouse. He insisted on a remote location. Sarah and I went together. Miles felt a jolt. Both of you? To an abandoned warehouse, to meet a blackmailer. Mark nodded, his face a mask of misery. We thought we could talk him down, convince him to change his mind. But he was relentless. He said he was tired of living in the shadows, that he deserved a cut for keeping our dirty little secret. And then what happened? Miles's voice was low, dangerous. Mark swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror. We argued. It got heated. He started taunting Sarah, calling her names, bringing up our parents' deception. He said he would expose us, that he would tell our children the truth. Sarah snapped. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She grabbed something, a heavy wrench, from a toolbox near the entrance. She hit him. Once, twice. He fell. He wasn't moving. A chilling silence descended upon the room. Miles and Lena looked at each other, the same grim realization dawning on both their faces. She killed him? Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face again. Yes, she didn't mean to. It was an accident. She just reacted. She was so terrified of everything coming out. And the decapitation? Miles asked, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion. Was that an accident too? Mark flinched. No, that was my idea. After we realized he was dead. Panicked. I remembered an old movie. Something about removing the head to prevent identification. I just wanted to make him disappear, to erase the evidence, to protect Sarah, to protect our family. He confessed to the entire gruesome aftermath. Using a saw he found in the warehouse to decapitate Thomas, wrapping the head in a tarp and disposing of it in a remote, wooded area, and then returning to clean up the scene as best as they could. He described the desperate, panicked attempts to wipe away any trace of their presence, the agonizing hours spent in the dark, trying to bury their monstrous secret beneath a layer of lies and denial. The confession was a torrent of anguish and self-loathing, a man utterly broken by the weight of his crimes and the unimaginable truth of his life. Miles and Lena listened, their faces grim, the details of the crime now illuminated by the horrifying truth of familial betrayal and incest. After Mark's full confession, Miles and Lena went to Sarah's house. The suburban tranquility now felt like a grotesque mockery. Sarah opened the door, her eyes red and swollen, as if she had been crying for hours. She already knew. Mark must have called her, or perhaps the truth was simply too big to contain. "Where's Mark?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He's at the precinct, Mrs. Jenkins," Miles replied, his voice firm. "He's confessed to everything. About Thomas, about the blackmail, and about your involvement in his murder." Sarah's shoulders slumped. She offered no resistance, No further denials. She simply nodded, her gaze vacant, lost in a world of unimaginable horror. "I tried to stop him," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "He was going to tell everyone. Our children. Our beautiful children. Couldn't let him. I couldn't." Her confession mirrored Mark's, a tale of desperation, fear, and a sudden violent act born out of the terror of exposure. She described the argument, Thomas's taunts, and the sudden, overwhelming surge of panic that led her to grab the wrench. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed. This response contains a fictional story with graphic, disturbing content that may be upsetting to some readers. Sarah's confession didn't begin to cover the full extent of the horror. It couldn't explain the brutality that went far beyond a simple act of self-defense. After hearing her words, Miles and Lena understood that the true barbarism lay not in the killing, but in what came after. They had to return to where it all began, to the place where the deception was exposed. With Sarah's consent, the detectives returned to the warehouse, the scene of the crime, this time with a new search warrant. They found dried bloodstains on the concrete floor that had been hastily wiped away, hidden under a pile of debris and grease. They found deep cuts on an old wooden workbench, as if something had been placed there and severed. The raw, chilling truth was more horrifying than any story. Lena stared at the cuts, a wave of nausea rising in her throat. "They did it here, right on this table," she whispered, her voice trembling. Miles nodded, his face expressionless. "Mark said he used an old saw. Maybe it's still here." They found it, discarded in a dark corner, the dried blood clinging to the rusty teeth. The metallic smell and the stench of decay were a horrifying reminder of the savagery it had witnessed. But the most disturbing part was Sarah's account of her actions after Thomas fell. She hadn't panicked like Mark. She had become eerily calm, as if a switch had been flipped in her mind. She had looked at Thomas's lifeless body, at his face, and a profound disgust, a deep-seated hatred, had emerged. She said that in that moment, she didn't see him as a brother, but as a curse, a terrible stain that had poisoned her entire life. She told Mark that they had to make Thomas unrecognizable. It wasn't just an act of self-preservation, but a symbolic act to erase him from their lives forever. That's why, after Mark severed his head, Sarah had stomped on Thomas's face, trying to disfigure it, to ensure that not even DNA could identify him. It was an act of pure, brutal hatred, a complete rejection of their blood ties. The confessions of both of them, which initially seemed to be a tale of desperation and panic, now took on a different color. It was a story of two people, trapped in a lie created by their parents, who finally acted with a savage ferocity, not out of fear, but out of self-disgust. They didn't just kill a man. They destroyed a part of themselves, a part of the disgusting truth they couldn't accept. Even though the confessions had revealed the brutal truth, Miles and Lena still needed more evidence to secure a conviction. Lena found a crucial clue, an old wooden box hidden in the basement of Robert and Eleanor's house, the parents of Mark and Sarah. Inside the box were old files, letters, and a faded diary. These documents revealed an even more tragic truth than they had imagined. Robert and Eleanor had not only hidden the fact that their children were siblings, they had done so to protect an even more monstrous secret. Eleanor's diary revealed that Thomas wasn't the only child who had been abandoned. There had been two others before him. Their names, their lives had all been hidden. The reason? Shame, fear, and an obsession with maintaining a perfect image for the public. With this evidence, Mark and Sarah were charged with first-degree murder. The trial attracted national attention. The horrific details of their crime, their relationship, and the lies their parents had created were laid bare for the public to see, shocking and horrifying everyone. Mark and Sarah were sentenced to life in prison. However, the real punishment was not the court's verdict. It was the complete unraveling of the family they had tried so desperately to protect. As they were being led away, they both stared at each other, no longer husband and wife, no longer brother and sister, but just two people forever separated by an unforgivable crime, by a secret that had consumed them from the inside out. As the case closed, Lena and Miles stood looking out at the city, their hearts heavy. They had solved the case, but there was no sense of victory. Instead, they felt a profound sadness for a family destroyed by deceit. They understood that, in some cases, the truth doesn't set you free, it destroys everything. The real consequence of the crime was not just the death of one man, but the collapse of a family, a foundation built on lies, that finally crumbled under its own weight.